This is a video for the development gap for GCSE geography, mainly focusing on the AQA-A specification, but it can be applied to other exam boards as well as that. So the first part of the specification states that you need to know methods of measurement. So I've got a list here. I'll just take you through them one by one. Birth rate. The higher the birth rate, the poorer the country is, because obviously there's less access to contraception, so there are more babies being born. Death rate, the higher death rate means it's actually a richer country. Some people would say that it's a poorer country because obviously there's more illnesses, less access to safe water, to nutrition, to healthcare. But in fact, it's actually a richer country because in a richer country, you've got an aging population. So because there's aging population, obviously with older age, you die quicker. Because obviously you haven't got that much energy anymore. So the older you get, the closer you are to death, essentially. So that's why it's actually a richer country, because in richer countries they've got better access to healthcare, nutrition, sanitation, clean water. So that's why there's a higher death rate than birth rate in richer countries, because obviously in richer countries you've got more access to contraception. Infant mortality rate, just the number of babies that die per 1,000 babies. So the lower the infant mortality rate, the more richer the country is. Pretty self-explanatory. There's better technology, just stuff like that. People per doctor. The more people there are per doctor, the poorer the country, because a denser population means that there are more people in an area, and not many people actually have qualifications to be a doctor. So the more people there are per doctor, the poorer the country is, because that puts a strain on the doctor, and not all people can benefit from it because obviously there are so many to treat. Access to safe water. The more access there is to safe water, the richer the country. It's pretty self-explanatory. In the UK, for example, we've got plenty of access to clean water, whereas in a developing country such as, I don't know, Uganda, for example, they got less access to safe water, and therefore, there are more deaths and illnesses arising because of that. Life expectancy, the higher the life expectancy, the richer the country is. Pretty self-explanatory again. If they can live longer, that's usually in developed countries, such as like the UK or the USA, Germany, Western countries, basically. Because obviously better access to healthcare, nutrition, sanitation, etc. The Human Development Index, the higher the HDI, the richer the country. This is on a scale from 0 to 1 and takes into account school life expectancy, birth life expectancy, and literacy rates. And the gross national product is the total value of goods produced in a country in a year. But this is a poor measure, as it doesn't measure people's living standards. So next you need to know about the 4 different ways the world is classified. Those are worlds, 5-fold division, the north-south divide, and development stages. So I'll take you through all of these in depth. So for worlds, we've got the first world, the second world, and the third world. The first world are those MEDCs, the more economically developed countries, the developed countries, UK, USA, France, Germany, those Western countries essentially. Then the second world countries are those NICs, the newly industrializing countries, emerging countries, so Brazil, India, China, those countries. And then third world countries are those with limited access to sanitation, to nutrition, to clean water, to see doctors, with low life expectancies. So those LEDCs, the less economically developed countries. So those in the continent of Africa, for example, like Zambia, Uganda, Congo, those countries. Then the next one, we've got the 5-fold division. So rich industrializing, those are the MEDCs, again the UK, for example, the oil exporting countries where exports of oil are dominant, so those such as Saudi Arabia. Newly industrializing countries, those are the NICs, again the NICs, so like China, Brazil, India. The former communist countries, so those are like Eastern European countries, for example, like Romania and Poland, where they used to be a communist nation, and heavily indebted countries. So those are the ones where many very poor countries have to borrow large sums of money to be able to develop their country. So those are like in Africa, the continent of Africa, for example. And yeah, that's actually a common mistake. Africa's not a country; it's a continent. And if you do say it's a country, you will lose marks in the exam. So just be aware of that. And yeah, so I'll talk about the heavily indebted countries when I come to talk about loans and ways to reduce global inequalities. And then the North-South divide. This was stated in the 1971 Brandt Report, which basically stated that the north of the world is richer and the south is poorer, which generally that is true. But when you do think about it, like above the equator, you've got like countries like USA, the UK, Spain, France, Germany, those developed countries. But then you do have countries such as like Iraq and those sort of countries that are like just around the equator, so it can be quite unreliable. And then the south of like below the equator is generally poorer, but then when you think about it, Brazil is below the equator, it's in the southern part of the world, and that's a developing country. You've also got Australia and New Zealand, which are developed countries, and they are very south of the world, so that is quite unreliable. And then development stages, so I've basically mentioned these already: the LEDCs, MEDCs, NICs. LEDCs are less developed, MEDCs most developed, and NICs are developing. So now we've got quality of life versus standard of living. So quality of life, it's more subjective, so that means it's more like a person's point of view. So it's more subjective, a person's view of their quality of life, and it varies from person to person. I mean, take Saudi Arabia for example. Oil exporters are going to be really, really rich because obviously oil is a key component in many industries nowadays. So they're going to be very rich, and it does make their GDP per capita seem fairly high, but actually that's just from very few people's incomes, extremely high incomes, because they're an oil exporting country, whereas the majority of Saudi Arabia are actually very poor. But because of the oil exporting industry, the GDP per capita is a lot higher, even though the majority of people are actually on very low incomes. So an oil exporter in Saudi Arabia would have a very positive quality of life, whereas a poorer person, just a normal citizen in Saudi Arabia, would have a fairly poor quality of life. So that's why it varies from person to person. Whereas standard of living, it's more objective as it takes into account factors. These are health, education, income, etc. So the amount of people who actually have access to a doctor, access to healthcare, the literacy rate, income, etc. So next you need to know about worsening global inequalities, and there are factors, so social, political, economic and physical or environmental factors that actually worsen global inequalities. So social, low literacy rates and access to school, and poor healthcare, less access to clean water, and more people per doctor actually worsens global inequalities because there's lower education, poorer healthcare, thus more people are dying. More people per doctor put strain on the doctor, so less people are actually able to be treated, and less access to clean water all contributes to a deteriorating quality of life and standard of living. So these social factors actually worsen global inequalities, because in some countries where this is all improving, it's completely deteriorating in other countries, which actually worsens the global inequalities. The next one, political. Simply a corrupt government worsens global inequalities, and an example is Zimbabwe. The president, Robert Mugabe, basically takes all the money that Zimbabwe get from like loans or aid. he keeps all of this for himself, for his own benefit. Therefore, the citizens of Zimbabwe, they never see this money, or they never see any improvement in their infrastructure, their education, their access to healthcare. And this is all worsening global inequalities because their quality of life and standard of living is falling dramatically. So it does worsen global inequalities, and also because hyperinflation is occurring in Zimbabwe as a result of this corrupt government. You can literally go into a shop in Zimbabwe, get a can of beans and a couple of tomatoes and pay a few $1 billion for it. It's absolutely ridiculous because this hyperinflation it plays a huge role in worsening these global inequalities. Economic factors. So raw materials, they usually come from poorer countries. I mean, if you like take fruit and vegetables for example. If you go to your local Tesco's or Asda or Sainsbury's, get a packet of strawberries, you'll see it comes from Kenya. So these poor countries, they do provide raw materials like like things that manufacturers need. It depends, like coal, wood, or then again agricultural products like fruit and vegetable. Basically the first world countries, they don't want to pay so much for these goods, so there's competition between the poorer countries because farmers, they need to gain some sort of income. Like they need to have a sustainable standard of living or sustainable production in their job, so they do need to gain an income. And because of the competition between the poorer countries, prices are gradually decreasing over time, so it's just not sustainable for their income. And also countries emerging from civil wars, they do suffer a lot from famine, and therefore many starve. And TNC, so transnational corporations, companies that have their operations elsewhere, like Nike for example, they got their HQ in the USA, but they got like their factories in China and Vietnam and Southern American countries, African countries, and they're actually put off by an educated workforce. And finally, the physical factors or environmental. Mountains and coastal ports can actually affect trade, and droughts in Eastern Africa. I forgot to put an A there, but that should be as with an A. So if there are many mountains, basically the people and their industries are interlocked, so it's quite hard to get there, and a lack of coastal ports means it's very hard for boats to come into the country and actually be able to trade. So these are all factors that actually contribute to worsening global inequalities. So a case study for global inequalities is the Hurricane Ivan, and this occurred on the 7th of September 2004. There were winds of 200 kilometers per hour, and it reached its peak size when it was approaching Texas. The hurricane actually occurred across all of the Gulf of Mexico, which affected a number of Caribbean islands and countries such as Grenada. Some effects of this is that trees and buildings collapsed, which blocked the roads. 90% of buildings were damaged and destroyed, including the Prime Minister's house, and 37 were killed. Also, infrastructure was damaged, and examples of this is that the water and telecommunication systems were affected. And responses to this event, to this natural hazard, in the short term, aid for food and medicine was sent over, but in the long term, agriculture, tourism, infrastructure was badly affected, and it will cause huge repair costs, causing great hardship for Grenada, for example, because Grenada is quite a poor country. So because its agriculture has been affected, and its agriculture does dominate there, and tourism as well, and infrastructure, it's all gonna affect economically, because agriculture, the farmers' incomes are actually going to decrease, and tourism is going to decrease, so less spending there. And also infrastructure, it does cost a lot of money to repair roads and buildings and airports, for example. So a way in which, three ways in which global inequality are reduced are conservation swaps, fair trade, and loans and aid. So conservation swaps are basically an agreement to pay off part of the country's debt in return for them to undergo an environmental project, and this started in the 1980s. So basically, the more developed countries will pay off part of a country's debt, so usually the LEDCs, in return for them to undergo an environmental project, because usually these LEDCs have large amounts of rainforest or a lot of land there, so they can undergo many environmental projects. Bolivia was actually the first country to benefit from this. The North American Conservation Group paid off $650,000 of their debt in return for them to set aside a large amount of rainforest to set up a nature reserve. So that's an example of a conservation swap. Fair trade, it's an international agreement in which farmers in developing countries gain a living wage due to a guaranteed minimum price. Between 2006 and 2007, there was a 150% increase in goods produced, and 7 million farmers actually benefit from this. So 58 countries, because the minimum price does basically guarantee a living wage for the farmers for them to be able to gain a sustainable income. And finally, loans and aid. Loans come from intergovernmental organizations, and it's paid back depending on the situation, and poorer countries benefit from lower interest rates. So loans are flows of money basically. So Brazil borrowed a huge amount of money in the 1970s to build factories to export their raw materials. So loans involve money, and aid actually it involves gifts. So like medicine, food, like there's a lot of aid going on in during natural hazards such as earthquakes and volcanoes, but it does occur on a daily basis as well. So the loans do come from intergovernmental organizations. So those are the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, for example. And if it's sort of a short-term project, the debt can be paid back sooner. But if it is in a developing country and there's civil war going on, for example, it will take a much longer amount of time to actually pay back the debt. And sometimes the debts are actually completely written off. They don't the country doesn't have to pay it back, but that's only in extreme situations. But poorer countries, so these developing ones, they do actually benefit from lower interest rates because they can't pay back so much of it, so their interest rates are lowered. And also, micro enterprises are a solution to this. So, for example, Sara Garcia in Peru. So she basically, in '94, she borrowed $1,845, and this was invested in buying equipment to make pattern handkerchiefs. And she also hired extra workers. So these extra workers, they gain an income, and that benefits their families. And output in her small business actually increased from 20 handkerchiefs to 500 per day. So that's obviously going to increase her income and her revenues and profits, which benefits her. And actually her repayment was paid back on time. So the positives and the negatives of aid on donor countries, so those are the ones that actually donate the aid. Short-term aid, it provides a feel-good factor for the donors because they feel like they're doing something great. Long-term, trade may continue into the future because good relations are built, and also this does provide paid work for the donors overseas. Top-down aid is it's aid on a large scale, which is actually aid given to the government. So on the one hand, donors do feel in control, as it is controlled by IGO, so the intergovernmental organizations, those being the IMF and the World Bank, for example. But on the other hand, some do feel that money is wasted because it's such a large amount, so they feel that not as much money has to be spent and still provide the same amount of aid. Bottom-up aid, that's aid on a smaller scale, which does directly benefit the recipients. So again, it does provide a feel-good factor for the donor, and it builds strong relations. And an example of the bottom-up aid would be, when you see on TV, sponsor a child today and provide, books for them and stuff. That's what bottom-up aid is, because directly affecting someone. So some do believe that that's a lot better than top-down aid, because it does actually directly benefit the individuals, so people feel a lot more confident that it is actually benefiting someone because they know where it's going. So, positives and negatives of aid on recipient countries. In the short term, it does provide continuous aid, which does benefit the citizens of the recipient country. But some do believe that not all needs may be met, because people don't actually know the actual needs. Like in a natural hazard, yeah, they need food, they need medicine, for example, but they don't actually know what's going on behind the scenes. Long-term aid, it does improve agriculture, which does in turn improve skills and income, but it can actually cause dependency on the donor country. There may be a lack of possibility in maintaining infrastructure, and some do lose land due to large-scale projects. Because take a TNC, for example, you know, they're going to have a lot more power over a farmer who owns some land. Like, they're not going to really be able to fight that back. But in terms of aid, that does happen as well. Top-down aids, that's aid on a large scale, so the aid actually goes to the national governments. So it does improve national infrastructure, and as a result, the countries improve as a whole. But unfortunately, most do not benefit directly. This aid may just go to benefiting infrastructure, which does, I mean, improving infrastructure, and it does benefit people, but it won't benefit their health, for example. Being able to travel a lot easier from rural to urban areas isn't really going to improve their health. Whereas bottom-up aid, that's aid on a smaller scale, which does benefit people directly. Like when you see those adverts on TV, like ActionAid, for example, like sponsor a child today, your £2 could give a child some books and some medicine. That's what bottom-up aid is, because it is benefiting that child directly. So yeah, it's good because there's no corruption, so not much money is lost, and it's also sustainable due to efficient technology. However, charity funds could reduce in an economic recession, because when there's a recession, the real value of people's income falls, so they're not going to be able to afford to be able to continue sponsoring the child, for example. So that's why it could decrease during a recession and therefore have a negative impact on the recipient country. So the next 3 slides will be 3 different types of development projects. You only really need to know one, like in a lot of detail, but I'll take you through the 3 of them. So that's small scale, medium scale, and large scale. So the first one is a small scale development project, and it is the Community Youth Empowerment Program. This is where voluntary UK students, part of the Restless Development Program, who are usually gap year students, they work with pupils in developing countries, so the LEDCs, such as Uganda, for example, and they basically, through role play, for example, they improve the knowledge of AIDS, to improve the knowledge of environmental health. They speak a lot about health, nutrition, sanitation, and how to improve this. And in order to teach energy efficient methods, they teach the pupils and their families how to construct fuel efficient stoves, for example. And an example in which this has happened is in Kabaja village in Uganda. 3 natural springs were polluted, so the students constructed a covered water tank to keep the pollution out of the water, and it improves living standards because their access to clean water increases and the water is taken from taps, so again, no pollution gets in. A medium scale development project, an example is ActionAid, and what they do is they work in developing countries within local communities in an attempt to reduce poverty, and what they target is food, education, sexual health, security, government, and women's rights. And they basically try to improve the amount of food they eat and whether it's got the right nutritions for them. They also try to increase education, so their literacy rates increase and they're able to to study, to get a good degree, or just some form of a qualification, the equivalent of an A level or a GCSE, for example, so that they have more chances in the future to increase their income in higher paid work. Sexual health, so HIV and AIDS, to benefit their own health. Security, whether they in an attempt to make them feel a lot more safe where they live. The government, to ensure that the government's not so corrupt, or just not corrupt at all, like in Zimbabwe, in order to make sure they benefit from any loans or aids they get. And women's rights. In Western countries, women, there is still like some imbalance in salaries, for example, in Western countries like the UK or France, but in these developing countries, in the LEDCs, there's actually still a huge imbalance in gender equality. So they are trying to increase women's rights, like there has been in Western countries. How they do this, they use sponsorship schemes where donors can sponsor a child, which improves the child's quality of life. So as I said previously, like there's adverts on TV, like sponsor a child today, your £2 can provide books or medicine for them. That's basically what it is. And an example where this has actually happened is Dharavi in Mumbai. The world's poorest district, an extremely high population and very, very, very few access to services. I mean, if you just look up Dharavi on Google Images, you will see the state of it. There's just like mud huts just so close to each other. It's like there's no space for them to even walk in between. It's just so densely populated with such few services. Their quality of life is just completely deteriorated. Like it's a very poor quality of life. And finally, a large-scale development project. An example is the Cahora Bassa Dam in Mozambique. It was started by the Portuguese government in the 1960s, continued in 1995 due to a civil war postponing it. So because of the civil war, they had to postpone construction. But it did start again in 1995, and it involves 5 huge turbines. Oh God, I don't know how I just done that, but 5 huge turbines, making it the second largest hydroelectric power station scheme in Africa, the largest being the Aswan Dam in Egypt. And it has been successful, but it's also been unsuccessful. In fact, only 1% of Mozambique's population benefit, because most of the electricity is actually sold to other countries such as South Africa. But it does have the potential to benefit Mozambique as a whole, but unfortunately it does reduce the river flow, affecting the shrimp industry in the lower valley of the river. So you also need to know about contrasting EU countries. So the EU, obviously it's a trade bloc, the European Union, in Europe, and Europe is generally seen as really developed, Western countries, but actually there are huge inequalities in the EU. I mean, take the core countries such as UK and Germany and France, for example. So the more developed countries in Europe, in the EU, and then the periphery countries, the less developed countries within the EU, so like Romania, Poland, Lithuania, the former communist countries. So the 2 examples I've got here, Germany and Romania. In Germany, the GDP per capita is approximately $41,000 per capita, whereas in Romania it's approximately 21,100 GDP per capita. The literacy rate in Germany, it's 99%, whereas in Romania it's lower at 98.8%. In Germany, it's got approximately 2,400 kilometers of coast, and it's also got the Rhine River, which does stretch around Europe, like to Switzerland, for example. And because of this large amount of coast and the Rhine River, there are more ports and ability to be able to trade and travel between countries, to transport the goods. Whereas in Romania, the Carpathian Mountains dominate, which interlocks a lot of land. So it does reduce the ability to be able to transport within between different places, which does affect trade a lot because they're not able to trade so much. The death rate in Germany is slightly lower, at 11.6 deaths per thousand, whereas in Romania it's 11.9 deaths per thousand. In Germany, the unemployment is significantly lower than Romania at 7.7%, whereas in Romania it's 24%, and this is actually a lot of youth unemployment as well. They're not able to, they're too dependent on like their families and stuff like that, so they haven't got much of an incentive to find a job. But also because like Romania has quite a low GDP per capita, firms aren't able to employ so many people, and they also haven't got much access to education, so they can't find a well-paid job. In Germany, only 1.6% of the population work in agriculture, whereas in Romania this is significantly higher, at 28.3%. In Germany, 73.8% work in services, and in Romania this is significantly lower at 42.8%. So if you take agriculture and services, so agriculture, it's significantly lower in Germany, but services are significantly higher. This is because they've got more education. The firms are able to employ more people. The education's a lot higher, a lot better, whereas in Romania, because it's a former communist country, this is all kind of not very sustainable, not very secure. So the education's a lot lower, and because they got so much land, agriculture is a lot higher, and those employed in services, it's significantly lower because of the lack of education that and qualifications that the people have. So this is quite a cramped slide, but you should be able to read all of it. I mean, I tried to include all the relevant information, and I did, but I just wanted to keep it all on one slide, so don't have to keep switching between one slide to another. So these are policies to reduce EU inequalities. We'll start with CAP, that's the Common Agricultural Policy, and this is where a minimum price is set on the production of food to ensure enough food for Europe's population and stabilise farmers' incomes. So on the one hand, this is good because the farmers' incomes are stabilised and there is a sustainable amount of food ensured for the population, but also it's not really good because only 5.5% of the EU's population actually works in agriculture, and a huge amount of money is spent on them. 1.6% of the EU GDP, which 1.6% doesn't sound a lot, but the EU GDP is massive in the trillions. So when you think about it, millions are actually spent for 5.5% of those working in the EU in agriculture. So that's one reason why it's not good, because people think that a lot of money is wasted on this, but actually it is pretty good because the excess stock is stored and it is used in times of need. So if there's a hazard, a natural hazard like a flood or an earthquake damaging the crop yield of the farmers, there is excess stock that has been stored, and so it is used in these times of needs. The next one, the EIB, the European Investment Bank, they basically invest money in declining regions. So those that have a decline in their industry or agriculture, depending on what dominates the economy there. Often in training, so if there's a decline in agriculture, so the primary industry, or like manufacturing in the secondary industry, the European Investment Bank invests money for the population to be trained for jobs in third and quaternary industries, so like those are services like banking and then medicine and stuff like that, finance. The next one is the Urban 2 Fund, which invests money in funding declining districts in European cities to provide sustainable development, both economically and socially. So what they do, they refurbish abandoned buildings to provide new living areas, train people to work in jobs that benefit the population, so like medicine or banking, and to find a stable job and to provide eco-friendly transportation, etc. There are approximately 70 programs which has affected over 2 million people. That should be has, not as. I'll just highlight that. It should be has, not as. It has affected over 2 million people, and from 2000 to 2006 there was a fairly high budget, of 728.3 million euros. An example where Urban 2 Fund has been successful is the town of Teruel in northern Spain, which the population of that town, they benefited from a new ring road, which cut congestion by over 20%, and it did improve air quality and provide new paths for cyclists and pedestrians to use. And the total cost of this was 16.6 million euros, which isn't really a lot when you think about it, because it's benefiting a whole city, and it's just, when you think about it, quite a small part of the budget. And finally, structural funds. Their main spending is on infrastructure to improve transportation. I really can't highlight today, but God, their main spending is on infrastructure to improve transportation in poor European regions, mainly those whose GDP is 75% less than the EU's target. And between 2007 and 2013, 347.4 billion euros was spent. So yeah, these are 4 policies to help to reduce EU inequalities, and they are generally quite successful. So yeah. So to end this like PowerPoint slide, I've just got a quiz here. Just pause the video, have a go answering these 5 questions, and then answers are on the next slide. So just press play when you're ready. So the quiz answers. What does the 1971 Brandt Report state? It states that the northern part of the world is richer and the southern part of the world is poorer. What was the first country to benefit from a conservation swap? Bolivia. Name 2 effects of the Hurricane Ivan. 37 were killed and 90% of the buildings were damaged or destroyed. There are other effects, but this are just two examples. Where has a small-scale development project occurred? Kabaja village, or if you just said Uganda, that's fine, but it's always better to specify. And finally, which mountains are situated in Romania? In Romania, that's the Carpathian Mountains. So I hope this video has benefited you. Thanks for watching. If you have any more recommendations, do leave comments below. There are some topics that obviously I don't do because I hadn't studied them at GCSE, but if I don't do them, then obviously I always tell people that I haven't done them. But thanks for watching, and good luck in your exams.